So my first Benelux vehicle suggestion video is doing pretty well. And a couple of viewers requested I make the same type of video for other nations. And I thought it was a pretty good idea. So I've decided I will continue making videos discussing potential nations and coalitions and their vehicles that could be added to War Thunder. One of the nations I'm most excited for to be added is Korea. Especially South Korea, which we will be talking about today. And the next video will be talking about the North, so stay tuned for that. Now, one thing we first have to talk about is how these nations could or should be added. One thing is for sure, and that is that both nations don't really have low tier. Before and during the Second World War, Korea was occupied by Japan, so Korea didn't have any of their own tanks then. Then, for a couple months after Japan was defeated, Korea was united and everyone was happy. I couldn't find if they had any tanks at this time. I don't believe so, and if they do, they definitely don't have any unique ones. And then, of course, the US and the Soviet Union saw Korea and decided that, hey, we can fight over this. Since then, Korea has been divided, and both first had tanks from other nations before making their own. Now, how to implement both Koreas into the game? The user Chieftain Warrior made a post on the forums suggesting a united Korean tech tree. This tree was also a big source of info for me, alongside this other post made by Flores_, who instead made a separate South Korean tech tree. Both their posts I'll leave a link to in the description. I would personally prefer both nations having their own separate tech trees. Now granted, their trees wouldn't be super big, but I don't really see the problem in that. I think they'd be a comparable size to Israel currently. But I don't think it's going to happen this way. There are already leaks suggesting South Korea is going to be added to the US as a subtree. Which is fine, but I don't really see why though. Why it could just be its own separate tree. I've seen people say that Gaijin won't add any new trees, which in my thorough 5-second search I couldn't find a statement from Gaijin themselves on. Now, onto the vehicles. Whereas North Korea was occupied by the commies, the South instead got the capitalists, so they have a good number of American vehicles. During the Korean War, South Korean forces received Chaffees, EZ-8 Shermans, M46s and M47s. Now it should be noted that there were more vehicles in Korea fighting at this time, like the M46 and Churchills. But the reason they weren't on the list is because these weren't used by the Koreans. Vehicles like the M46 were only used by the Americans, whereas the before mentioned vehicles were given to the Koreans themselves. Just wanted to make that clear. South Korea also received modified M48s, designated as M48A3K. They were similar to the regular M48A3. They received laser rangefinders, improved engines, and a AP FSDS shell for the 90mm. These vehicles were later further upgraded by the Koreans to the M48A5K1, now receiving a 105mm gun and side skirts. You also had the M48A5KW, which was like the K1, but with the side skirts removed, but receiving the Israeli Erdon low-profile cupolas. The M48A5K2 was again very similar to the K1, now retaining the side skirts, receiving the Erdon cupola, and getting a better APFSDS shell. Though from the south, the South Koreans also had a couple of Soviet vehicles. They had a handful of Tiran 6s, Israeli versions of the T-62, and a couple of T-72 M1s, both of which were secretly used by the Koreans in a training exercise. During the 90s, South Korea also received some Russian tanks as a debt payoff. They got 70 BMP-3s and 33 T-80Us. Yes, the ones that are currently being blown up. It's also noted that in addition to this they got 2 T-80UKs, but I'm not exactly sure what they mean by this. I don't believe they're referring to the T-80UK like the one we have in game. No, the one with the T-90Is. As far as I'm aware, that was just a one-off prototype. I couldn't find what exactly they're talking about here. If you know anything, please do let me know in the comments. One thing I do want to mention is that the BMP-3 and T-80UK in the Soviet tech tree both have user-made camos for the Korean 3rd Armor Brigade, and the regular T-80U has a unique South Korean camo as well, that you can get for Golden Eagles, which I think is pretty neat. It's a pretty cool detail. Going back to the Americans a bit, let's talk about the K200, basically a Korean version of the M113. As a base APC, it obviously can't really be added, but there are some fun variants. First off is a very simple one, with just a TOW or ITO missile. very similar to what we already have in-game. There's also a variant carrying the Soviet Metis M missile. I'll mention the chassis a couple more times later on, but let's first talk about the KAF-V series. These are a series of vehicle projects by South Korea experimenting on the K200 chassis. The first variant is the KAF-V-25, with a stabilized 25mm autocannon in a turret. There's also the KAF-V-30A, a very similar vehicle, now with a 30mm and a 7.62 machine gun. The KAF-V-30M also definitely exists, now with a 30mm and a crewless turret, but yeah, leave that one out, please. They also armed this thing with a 90mm gun in a cockerel turret, turning it in a sort of light tank. To replace the K200, Korea developed the K21 infantry fighting vehicle, looking kinda like a knockoff CV-90 in my opinion, but it has a 40mm autocannon with a very potent AP-FSDS round, and a good fire control system with a stabilizer and thermals. There's also another variant carrying AT-1 1K Raybolt fire and forget missiles. In addition, Korea also made the AS-21 Redback as an expert vehicle for Australia, if you couldn't tell by the name. The 40mm is replaced with a 30mm Bushmaster, the AT-1Ks with spikes, and it gets some light add-on armor as well as Iron Fist active protection system. Like what seems like almost every nation in the world, South Korea also received M109 howitzers, but they renamed them to K-55s. This was later upgraded to the K-55A1, receiving several systems taken from the K-9, like the semi-autoloader, increasing fire rate and getting better ammunition. Speaking of which, let's talk about the K-9, the only South Korean vehicle currently in-game, in the form of the Vidar. The Korean version would pretty much be the same. The K9A1 doesn't really have any upgrades that would have an effect in-game, but the K9A2 is currently under development as a prototype, receiving a autoloader, eliminating 2 of the crew members, and receiving better thermals as well. Not really artillery, but there's also the K242A1, a 107mm mortar mounted on a K200. The same mortar was mounted on the Swedish Bandwagen 206, named the K532. The K281A01 instead has an autoloader 81mm mortar, and is to replace the K242A1. These vehicles are all mortar carriers, and as mentioned in my first Benelux video, I don't know if mortars could really work in-game as event vehicles, maybe. They wouldn't be very competitive, that's for sure, but I wanted to name them anyway. It's a similar story for the following vehicles, all being rocket artillery. Now we do actually have a decent number of rocket vehicles in-game, so I could see these things being added at some point, but I wouldn't really count on them being added anytime soon. The first is the K163A1, being just a truck, with a fuck ton of 130mm rockets. Korea also used the American M270, which you might be familiar with. To replace these, Korea made the K239, armed with 239mm KMLRS rockets. Now transitioning into wheeled vehicles, we have the K105A1, a truck with a 105mm fuck-off howitzer, which I would love to have in the game. Then we have the K116 and the K113, the obligatory jeeps with a recoilless rifle or tow missile respectively. Basically a newer version of this is the K145C1, a Kia with the same AT-1K missile as the K-21 mentioned previously. Korea also has the Israeli Plosan Sandcat, armed with the Spike NLOS missile, which I'm pretty sure would be new to the game, at least for ground vehicles. If I understand it correctly, these missiles would work similarly to the one in the 2077 April Fools event, but I don't know if Gaijin even wants to add these types of missiles, but personally I hope not. The Black Fox experimental vehicle is an 8x8 wheeled vehicle with a turret very similar to the one on the Nammer 30, with a Bushmaster 30mm and Spike LRs, like the Nammer. The Tarantula 6x6 is a light armored fire support vehicle developed for Indonesia. It has a cockerel turret with a 90mm as well as the usual stabilizer, thermals and AP FSDS or heat shells. Another vehicle with the 90mm cockerel turret is the KW1 SFV prototype, a very similar vehicle to the Tarantula. The KW2 Jupiter is a much larger 8x8, with a 120mm cannon in a crewless turret, and the same soft kill active protection system as the K2 Black Panther, which we will get to. The KW2 on the surface looks basically like a striker on steroids, to be honest. I mean, just look how fucking huge it is. The last revealed prototype is the N-Wave, which is currently under development, armed with a 30mm Bushmaster, 81k ATGMs, and a hard kill active protection system. For SPAA, South Korea is not lacking in options either, with one of the most iconic being the K263, functionally being a domestically produced M163 Falcon on the K200 chassis. But there's also the A3 variant, now on the K200 A1 body, meaning it gets better engine and transmission, as well as getting a better fine control system now with a stabilizer. The KW30 is an SPAA now on an 8x8 chassis, and armed with a stabilized twin 30mm autocannons. It doesn't get a radar however, but it can lock onto aircraft. The regular K30 Bio has a very similar turret, with the twin 30mm still, but now sitting on a modified K200 hull, and with a radar. The K30 Bio Hybrid is effectively the same thing, now just with an additional 4 surface-to-air missiles. On the same hull still, we have the K31 Chunma, a pure missile AA with a turret very similar to the one on the Ito 90M we have currently in game, but armed with domestically designed missiles. Going back to the K21 IFV for a bit, several Cockerel turrets were put on this thing. One with the exact same turret of the Finnish Patria CTCV 105 HP we have in the game as an event vehicle, with the same autoloader, laser and Generation 2 thermals. The second one has a very similar turret, now the same one that the CV90 105 has in-game. This one would obviously perform very similarly to the CV in-game, except the K21 gets a better Sabo shell. The last one would again have the same turret as the CV90, but now with a 120mm main gun, as well as getting Generation 3 thermals for both the gunner and commander. Moving on to the last vehicle line of the day, the proper South Korean main battle tanks. Starting with the K1. The K1 is heavily based on the XM1, the prototype for the M1 Abrams, and it both looks and performs very similarly. It retains the same 105mm cannon, but has a noticeably different armor layout. In contrast to the Abrams, it also gets a commander side with commander override, as well as the funny suspension. These are technically 2 variants however, as the earlier ones only get night vision, whereas the later versions get thermals. Of course you also have a prototype, the XK1, which I think would make a good premium, primarily getting a slightly worse AP shell. The first upgrade to the K1 is the K1E1, but it wouldn't get anything you would notice in game, just upgrades to electrical systems and such. The K1E2 however does have some noticeable upgrades, getting a new and improved gun sight with better thermals, as well as access to better ammunition. The first major upgrade is the K1A1, getting better commander and gunner sights and improved armor, most notably the 105mm gun being upgraded to the German L44 120mm cannon. The last variant is the K1A2, getting better cameras and a soft kill active protection system. Last but certainly not least, the K2 Black Panther, a major upgrade over the K1, with better armor, better firepower, better mobility, and overall just being one of the most sexy tanks ever made. The gun is now upgraded to the longer L55, the same one found on the Leopard 2A6. It gets a soft kill active protection system and retains the funny suspension. I don't see a world where the K2 doesn't get added. The only problem is going to be adding variants for this thing. The K2 is sometimes seen with extra ERA, which they could add as a separate variant I suppose. There's also the K2 PIP, Product Improvement Program. This version would add stronger, hardened steel armor, and technological suspension that scans the terrain ahead and prepares the suspension, making for a super smooth ride. It would get add-on NERA and the domestic CAPS active protection system for further protection upgrades. Now the reason why I said it would is because this thing is not real. It was supposed to enter production years ago, but we have yet to see it. I personally would probably still add it, just to have a somewhat fuller top tier lineup, and because it's just a cool upgrade. Alternatively, they could add the XK2, a prototype adding just the aforementioned CAPS APS. For the rest, there are some other prototypes, like the K2EX, an export prototype, with the same technological suspension as before, Trophy APS, improved side armor, a remote-controlled weapon station, and improved programmable ammunitions. This was again just a prototype, however, but I still think it would make a good end-of-the-line MPT for South Korea. Or otherwise just as a premium. An alternative for the premium slot is the K2NO, a Norwegian prototype. This thing also gets the trophy APS and remote weapon system, and does get the regular ERA. This though is again just a prototype, and will never enter production. The one prototype made went up against the Leopard 2A7 in a contest for the next Norwegian main battle tank, and, well, the Leopard won. This is why I think this would make a better premium than the K2EX, or even just squadron vehicle, as the EX still has a chance to enter production. The last fun variant we'll talk about is the K2BL for Poland. It would again get the trophy APS and RCWS, as well as a separate ammo storage and better internal protection, as well as some add-on armor packages. No prototype has been made, however, only 2 models. The first one shows the add-on package for the side armor as well as the caps APS instead of the trophy, but overall looking less good in my opinion. The second model shows additional front and top armor and the trophy system, but now just looking downright silly. Again, this thing is not real, do not expect this thing to be added for the foreseeable future. As South Korea is likely going to be added as a subtree, I think we're facing a similar problem as with the Benelux here. There are more than enough vehicles here to make a proper tech tree, but Gaijin doesn't really seem to want that, as it means there's a chance player will reach top tier slightly quicker, meaning there's slightly less to purchase the way to top tier. Meaning there is a small chance Gaijin will make less money in the short term, which, if you couldn't tell, I think is dumb. The only other reason I can think of why they're doing this is because they just can't be fucking bothered to put in the effort of creating an entire tree, and I honestly don't know which one is worse. But who knows, maybe we'll still get the full tech tree, probably not. All I know is that I'm still very excited for whatever Korean vehicles we'll get. If you think I missed any vehicles or details, do let me know in the comments, and I'll mention them in the next episode, where I'll be talking about North Korea. If you like this video, I recommend checking out my videos on every Benelux vehicle that could be added for the ground subtree for France. Now subscribe.